교수님의 발표입니다. 이것도 제가 좀 읽어봤는데 굉장히 재밌습니다. 미리 약간 좀 티저라고 그러죠? 티저. 여기 좀 문제점들도 나옵니다. 아일랜드의 독특성도 있지만 우리가 생각해봐야 할 쟁점과 문제점 이런 것들을 좀 중심으로 여러분들이 공부를 하시면 좋을 것 같습니다. Please go ahead. You have 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay if I stand up?
Okay.
Thank you. I arrived yesterday afternoon, and if I keep sitting, I'm going to fall asleep, so you'll forgive me. So I decided I should stand. So I will do my best to keep it going. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk to you about what has been going on in Ireland. And just as the chair was saying, we have lessons, so I want to be frank. So there's a very positive story I will begin with about Ireland, but then, as you will see, the story is not necessarily so positive. So I'll try and develop that point. Let me start with the positive. So we have a tradition in my country that when we have a referendum, a national referendum, if the result is a popular result, the people gather in the square of Dublin Castle and celebrate. And so these are pictures of celebrations. And so we were the first country in the world to introduce gay marriage by a referendum. Now, I don't know how much you know about Ireland, but it's a very traditional country. I have the impression Korea is also a very traditional country. We're very traditional, we have a strong Catholic ethos. We're a country that has taken a long time to catch up with the process of social modernization. So we had gay marriage introduced in 2015 by a huge majority of Irish citizens in a referendum. And in 2018, we introduced abortion. Abortion was completely banned in my country before 2018. And now we have abortion more or less like every other country. And so what we have here is very good evidence of how my country has been quite dramatically going down the process of social modernization. And the relevance of this little story is that both of these referendums followed citizens' assemblies. So it was a citizen assembly that made the recommendation for these referendums. The government then listened to the Citizens' Assembly, and then the government held the referendums, and the referendum happened. So we're also the first country in the world to have major constitutional and policy reforms as a result of citizens' assemblies. So that's the positive story. So I was really interested this morning in listening to the colleague from Gordon Campbell from Canada talking about the lessons to be learned from the Canadian case. The Canadian case, the British Columbia case, was the sort of first stage in the worldwide introduction of citizens' assemblies. My country is the second stage. Belgium, we're going to hear later on, is the third stage. And I hope Korea is going to be the fourth. That's my big hope. And in each of these stages, I think there are lessons to be learned. So you'll see the lessons that I will try to explain to you from the Irish case. But let me start the story. Where does the Irish story begin? It begins in around 2010. We fell off an economic cliff. We had a major economic crisis. This was an existential crisis. Public servants, we all had huge pay cuts. People in the private sector were made unemployed. The developers left the country. Our banks were bankrupt. The economy was on its knees. The IMF and the European Union had to take over our economy for a number of years. And so we had huge anger, massive anger on the streets. This was a perfect crisis. And I don't know if you know the phrase, you should never waste a good crisis. Well, we didn't waste that good crisis. There was a lot of angry citizens. They were banging on the streets of the parliament. They were demanding reforms. And so the political scientists, we decided that we were going to get into a conversation about this, because we felt we had an argument to make. And so what we said in political science, in Irish political science, was we should look at what Canada did. We should look at British Columbia. We should look at these world's first citizens' assemblies of about 2005, 2006. And we should do the same thing in Ireland. I was very fortunate. I was at all three of those citizens' assemblies because I write a book on electoral systems, so they used my book. So they called me to be a witness. So I had first-hand experience of just what a wonderful experience, what a wonderful thing it is to attend a citizens' assembly. So we were making these speeches and we were appearing on the radio and on the television and we were writing opinion pieces and we were saying we should have a citizens' assembly in Ireland. We should trust the citizens to guide us in how we can improve how politics runs in our country. And we were attacked. You stupid academics. You don't understand how politics works. You cannot have citizens taking important decisions. That's the job of professional politicians. Citizens are too stupid. This was the accusation that we were getting. So we decided, okay, they think we're stupid, well, let's see if we can prove them wrong. So we went and got some money, and we set up our own Citizens' Assembly in 2011. And we called it We the Citizens. And we had a lot of money, so we spent it. And we had a lot of publicity and media programs, and we went all around the country promoting the idea of a Citizens' Assembly. And then we got 100 citizens together, and we gave them some difficult things to discuss. And the citizens were able to discuss it. And the citizens were able to come up with good recommendations. So we went back to the politicians and we said, it works. It can work in this country. You can trust the citizens. So why not do it yourselves? Why don't you listen to us? And they did. So they set up a Citizens' Assembly. It was called the Convention on the Constitution. But in effect, it was a Citizens' Assembly. And just look at that picture. I was reflecting on this morning as I was listening to the opening remarks. What is your favorite sound in the world? What is your favorite noise in the world? When I have a discussion with my wife will say, it's walking through a forest and listening to birdsong. It's listening to the birds in the trees and things like this. For me, my favorite sound in the world is standing in a room during a Citizens' Assembly and just listening to 100, in our case it's 100 citizens talking. They're sitting in small tables and they're all talking at the same time. They're having a dialogue. And that is a wonderful sound, and I really hope you get more of those sounds in the future here in Korea. But this is an example of the first Citizens' Assembly. I'll just mention a little bit of detail. It is unusual and it is worth reflecting on this, that a third of the members of this Citizens' Assemblies were from our National Assembly, were from our Parliament. So we had a member of Parliament sitting at the same table with ordinary citizens. And as a result of that, to this day, we have members of the Parliament now who were part of this, who are big supporters. They are fans, they are cheerleaders. They think a Citizens' Assembly is really good because they were involved in one of these themselves. Anyway, so it discussed all of these different things that you can see on the slide, including gay marriage and a number of other topics, and it made various recommendations. And it was seen to be a huge success. So because of that, we've now had lots of them. The most recent one was on drugs, which only finished a few years ago. So we've had now 6 Citizens' Assemblies, the one on the previous slide, and these other 5. So Citizens' Assemblies is something that we do, and this is why a lot of international attention is given to this. It does seem to be a big success for all of the different activities that they've discussed. And they've had important outcomes. So this is just an example of some of the main outcomes, the main policy changes that have been produced as a result of a Citizen Assembly. So we've had 6 referendums. I've already mentioned the 2 most prominent ones on marriage equality and on abortion. But as you can see, and I put it in a red box there, we've also had 3 referendums that were defeated. And I want to come back at the end of my remarks to the most recent referendums, which happened a few weeks ago, which were defeated, because I think this is where the negative part of the Irish story comes in. So we've had a number of referendums. We've had promises of more referendums to come, so there could be more in a few years. We've had a major climate policy change. Our national parliament declared a climate emergency, and all of these are following recommendations of different citizens' assemblies. We've had major parliamentary reforms, so we've had political reform. Our parliament today has a lot more power than used to be the case as a result of listening to recommendations of one of these citizens' assemblies. So there's been a lot of good policy outcomes. But you see the list, it looks impressive, But let me give you a clue to the problem with the Irish case. Across these 7 processes, 6 or 7 processes, we've had about 340, 350 recommendations, and only a fraction of those recommendations have been implemented. So this is one of the big lessons that I'll come to now in a moment when I try to explain the weakness of the Irish case. The weakness is that the politicians are still too influential. Politicians still have much too much power in trying to affect any real change. So let me spend my final bits of my remarks talking about the Irish model. And some of this has already come up, so I won't take too long on it. But the first thing to say on this slide is the Irish model looks very like a citizens' assembly almost anywhere around the world. So this is the good bit of the story. So these are the main features. If you have to summarize what a citizens' assembly is, we heard some great detail from my colleague a few minutes ago, but this is the main points about it. The first point is the random selection. And why is random selection important? Random selection is important for these 2 reasons. The first is that you get a mirror of society. You get very good representation of all the different groups, and that's really important because it's going to be the same here as it is in my country, but the elected parliament is not a mirror of society. There are too many, I don't know if you know the phrase, male, pale and stale. There's too many men. There's too many men of one ethnic grouping, and there's too many men of a certain age who are just too old. And so that, it's not representative, it's not a mirror of society. Well, obviously, if you're carrying out a random selection, you get a mirror of society. You get women, you get ethnic minorities, you get people who don't speak the language of the country, you get people who are not even citizens, you get people who are disabled, you get people who might have all sorts of particular issues, but they are selected, so they turn up. And then there's the second reason, no mandate. Because these people have been picked by their government. This is very different from, for example, what we saw in Iceland in 2011. Because in Iceland, they elected the 25 members of their citizen council. And those 25 elected members felt that they had a mandate. I have run for office, so I have my views, and I'm going to make sure that my views are expressed in this process. Whereas with a citizen assembly, you are picked randomly, you're selected, you have the honor, you have the privilege of being selected to be a member of the Citizen Assembly. So that produces a very different attitude among the members. There's an understanding that if you are selected, you're there to represent yourself. You're not there to represent women or men or left-wing people or right-wing people or climate change people, or you are there to represent yourself, to be educated and informed about a topic, to go in with an open mind, be prepared to change your mind, and then come out with hopefully a good recommendation. So this lack of a mandate is really crucial. The second feature of all citizens' assemblies is that it's inclusive. It's an inclusive process. So experts are included. Sometimes politicians condemn citizens' assemblies because they say it's just these ordinary citizens who are not informed. What about the experts? The better way to do this is to have professional, political scientists and lawyers and atomic engineers and people who really know what they're talking about. And the point is, yes, you need them, but they're there to be experts, to be witnesses. So you want the atomic engineers and the political scientists and the lawyers to come and be expert witnesses, to bring the members of the Citizens' Assembly up to speed so that the members can then speak and make recommendations and understand what's going on because they become informed. So experts are included, but not as members. And secondly, you must hear the words of interest groups and advocates and people who are personally impacted. So for example, when the Irish Citizen Assembly was discussing abortion, they heard from women. They heard from women who had had abortions, from women who had decided not to have abortions, from women who had abortions and thought that they regretted it, from people who, all the different perspectives they heard. They heard from church leaders. They heard from interest groups who are trying to promote change. So you want to hear from all the voices. They should be witnesses to help members of the Citizen Assembly understand what's going on. So that's the second point. It's an inclusive process. Everyone is there, not just the members. And then the third, which is the crucial ingredient, of course, is deliberation. The whole idea is the hard work of the Citizen Assembly is done in these small groups where the deliberation happens. And there is a trained facilitator, and the job of the facilitator is to make sure that if somebody like me is speaking too much, the facilitator should say, David, we've heard enough from you now, we need to hear from somebody else. There should be this idea that nobody's allowed to be a bully. There should be an idea that you have an open mind and that you're going to respect the voice of the other. So this whole sense that this is not a debate, this is a deliberative moment of dialogue, because it is only from that you get good, reflectful ideas from which you can get recommendations. So these are the features of the Irish model and the features of the Belgian model and the future Korean model and all of that. But then there are other features, and I'm going to be ending quite soon, but these are where my criticisms come in. And let me just sort of pick out a few of them. So what I've got here are the political science phrases, which actually I got from my colleague Min, who you're going to hear from later. He first developed these ideas of input, throughput, and output. Well, what do I mean? Input is the process leading up to establishing the Citizen Assembly, the process leading up to the establishment of the Citizen Assembly. That's input. Throughput is what goes on in that black box, what goes on during the Citizen Assembly. And output is what happens after. And the spoiler alert in the Irish case is that we're really bad on input and output. That's the big weakness. And that's, as you'll hear from Min later on in the Belgian case, that is an area where I think Belgium is much better than us. So what do I mean? Input. Who sets the agenda? In Ireland, it's the government. And we have had some really stupid topics on the agenda of citizen assemblies. Really, really stupid topics. Even if I mention them to you, they wouldn't make sense. They're just pointless. We've had some very good topics like abortion and gay marriage, but lots of other ones. But it is exclusively the government that sets the agenda. Very different from what we're going to hear a little later this afternoon. Then it goes into the citizen assembly, and on the whole, the throughput, the citizen assembly, on the whole, it is pretty good. It's run, it's run pretty well. But the one big weakness, if there's a way in which you can avoid this in Korea, I would strongly recommend it. Don't let the civil servants run it. Because that's what happens in Ireland. The civil servants are totally in control. So a prime minister decides they're going to set up a citizen assembly, the government sets the agenda, and then they find a civil servant and they say to the civil servant, you should come off your normal duties and you should run it. And the civil servant runs it extremely well as a civil servant would run it. But it's not somebody who is a professional, deliberative mini-public citizen assembly organizer. They don't know all the latest tricks of how to do it. And they tend to run it in a very top-down way. It's very tightly controlled. So that's a sort of second lesson in the Irish case. And then the third one, I don't know if you know that phrase, cherry picking. The cherry picking problem, which is a problem in all systems, but in our system, unfortunately, they're very good at cherry picking. So what happens is the Citizen Assembly produces, as I've said to you already, there have been about 340 recommendations, but only a small number of them have ever seen the light of day. So it is the government at the end of the process who says, okay, we'll accept that recommendation, probably because we were going to do it anyway. This one, we're not going to say anything about it, we'll just ignore it. This one, we're just going to reject it. And again, as we hear on the Belgian case, it's quite different in that regard. And it is that problem of output and the cherry picking by government, which I think is what is going to explain what I'm going to say in my last slide, which is I think citizen assemblies are probably doomed in Ireland. We may have seen our last citizen assembly now. And that's because of what just happened. So we had two referendums in March of this year. I gave you the results of the abortion and the gay marriage referendums at the start, and you saw that it was 62, 66% voting yes, 68% voted no in one referendum, 74% voted no in the other. That's a record. We've had about 44 referendums. That's the worst referendum result in the history of referendums in Ireland. That's a pretty bad result. And so the problem with this is that both of these issues, I won't even try to describe them because they're complex issues. They're very particular to Ireland. But both of them came as a result of recommendations of a citizen assembly. It was the Citizen Assembly on Gender Equality recommended these referendums to change our constitution. And these recommendations of the Citizen Assembly went to the Parliament. The Parliament set up a special committee to debate this in great detail. And the special committee of Parliament agreed with the Citizen Assembly. And then, I think it's about 2 years later, the government calls the referendums. And what did the government do? They didn't follow the wording. They didn't follow the recommendation. They just sort of they came up with wording that was very significantly different for what the referendum result would be, what the constitutional change would be. The wording was very different from what was recommended by the Citizen Assembly. And as a result of that, you ended up with wording that nobody liked, a huge campaign as we have in referendums where the two sides were very evenly divided, and then these terrible outcomes. And as a consequence of that, all the politicians are now saying, you know, we've got gay marriage and we've got abortion and we now have divorce and we have a lot of these other social modernization changes. Maybe we've done enough of those now. Maybe it's time to slow things down a bit. And in that sort of discussion, you get the sense that maybe we've had a few too many of these citizen assemblies. So I don't know if I'm going to be right. I hope I'm not. But I think, as I was saying a few minutes ago, this is probably the end of citizens' assemblies in Ireland. So if I go back to my opening remarks about the different stages, Canada was really good, but they made mistakes. Gordon Campbell did sort of indicate that. We were very good, but we've made mistakes. Belgium still is very good. I'm waiting to hear if there are big mistakes, but maybe Min can tell us. But I think the path is now open for you guys to take over and run the next stage. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
감사합니다. 아주 굉장히 일어서서 전달을 호소력 있게 참 잘해주신 것 같아요. 제가 말씀드렸다시피 굉장히 좋은 기회입니다. 다 들으셨겠지만 몇 가지 포인트들만 처음에 이런 얘기도 시작하셨어요. 그 경제적 위기가 왔을 때 그걸 잘 활용했다. 위기가 곧 기회다. 이런 얘기를 하셨고요. 그 다음에 이건 제가 들을 수밖에 없었던 얘기인데 정착자들의 역할이 컸습니다. 정착자들이 처음에 밀어붙였던 그 경험이 컸어요. 제가 반성하고 있습니다. 한국의 정착자들이 뭘 했는지. 또 부러운 게 뭐냐면 처음에 재단에서 돈을 펀딩을 해줬다는 얘기죠. 어틀랜틱 필란스로피라고 이거에 힘입어서 정착자들하고 재단이 힘을 합쳐서 연구를 하니까 정치가들이 받아들였다는 거예요. 여야를 불문하고 이것도 굉장히 부러운 거예요. 첫 시작이 우리나라에서 지금까지 볼 수가 없었던 일입니다. 우리나라의 장점은 쭉 들으셨습니다만 촛불, 그다음에 우리 강민정 의원님의 119 민주화, 이런 것처럼 강한 시민사회의 그 힘이 있는데 제도화가 안 됐던 거죠. 그건 우리의 힘인데 제도화 안 된 부분이 우리가 좀 아쉬운데 처음에 너무 잘 된 것 같아서 너무 부럽습니다. 정착자들이 열심히 연구했고 재단에서 재정적 지원해줘서 정치가들이 여야를 불문하고 받아들여서 실시가 됐어요. 그런데 마지막에 굉장히 걱정스러울 정도로 지금 거의 영어로 doomed라는 표현을 썼어요. 이제 우리는 망했다라는 데 쓰는 표현이거든요. 아일랜드. 좀 너무 과장하신 것 같긴 한데 그런데 거기서 제가 개인적으로 들었던 그 교훈은 성급하지 말자. 너무 서두르지 말자. 한 번으로 끝날 게 아닌데 자칫 잘못 밀어붙여서 아까 국민의 80%까지 반대하는 결과가 나와버리면은 동력이 완전히 상실돼 버리는 거거든요. 그러니까 그렇게 좋은 기회를 살려서 잘 시작했는데도 불구하고 실수를 한 거예요. 아까 미스테이크라는 표현을 하셨잖아요. 이렇게 너무 성급한 것은 좋지 않다. 이런 저는 생각을 갖게 됐습니다. 이건 개인적인 생각이고요. 지금 굉장히 많은 걸 저희가 배우고 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 좀 기억해 두시고 다시 한번 쪽지에다가 질문이나 뭐 코멘트가 있으시면 해주시고요. 이게 이제 기조발제 세션이고요. 여기에 저희가 티타임이 한 10분 정도 있습니다. 티타임 동안 조금 생각을 정리하셨다가 이제 2부에서는 더 흥미로운 사례들이 나옵니다. 벨기에도 나오고 한국의 최고의 전문가들이 한국에 대한 어떤 구상을 얘기하시는 기회가 될 겁니다. 그럼 이것으로써 그 2부의 첫 번째 기조발제 세션을 끝내고 10분간 티타임을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 우리 박수로 두 분 단체자님께 감사합니다.